Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. As always, it's my pleasure to have back with me today Charles Hugh Smith, well-followed and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Time once again, Charles, to exchange some ideas, which I always look forward to. Do you want to give a shout-out to our listeners on your latest book, Self-Reliance in the 21st Century? I have the cover here on the screen now.
Well, thank you, Gordon. And yeah, this is my response to the context that we're going to talk about today. In other words, we are collectively going to have to start taking more care of our own lives and finance and resources and not rely on globalized supply chains and government bailouts.
That's going to come out. I go through these slides that we prepared. Charles, as I normally do, I need to stress with our new viewers that this is not an interview. We do these videos as a way of us productively dialoguing the important trends that we're each individually identifying and simply make our synthesis as a discussion available to the public for those that might be interested or want to contribute comments. And by the way, we truly welcome and value all the comments. We learn as much from input on these videos as doing the videos themselves. In this session, we're going to show charts on just how perilous the current U.S. economic situation is. However, our goal is to illustrate how the powers to be are now trapped, actually by our social entitlement program expectations, which are in the process of delivering an inevitable death blow to our 70% consumption economy. And I stress that. A 70% consumption economy is a real exposure that nobody seems to be talking about. We believe it is a central issue, but presently gets little political or media coverage. To do this, we created the agenda shown here for our discussion. The key points we hope to leave you with are highlighted on the next two slides. The first point says we are eating our seed corn. So what do we mean by that? Well, as a way of introduction, let me just tell a little story here about I've just returned from Europe, a trip over there for 2 weeks, and prior to that, I had researched an Under the Lens video on China's problems, and something struck me that we may be missing while I was there, or at least coming back. In the U.S. and Europe, we take for granted that we receive government assistance in our old age. While in Europe, I witnessed firsthand how retirees have the richest retirement benefits and working benefits, for that matter, in the world. This was blatantly and abundantly clear as I visit many of my wife's retired relatives. They would be the absolute envy of any visiting American retiree. In China, on the other hand, Social Security and Medicare for the elderly doesn't exist, and therefore their consumption behavior is different. The CCP and Xi Jinping have a major problem now in solving its current transition of moving their economy from a capital investment-led economy to becoming a consumption-led economy. The Chinese people are frugal because they have to be. They must save for their old age and have enough kids to take care of them in their old age. It is cultural expectation of youth to take care of their elderly parents. But, starting on January the 1st, 2016, China finally ended its one-child policy, which has restricted the majority of the Chinese families to only one child for the last 35 years. The one-child policy has only compounded China's current economic transitioning policy. And a strong China is a strong global economy. A weak China is a seriously weak global economy in today's world. I'll ask you, Charles, to comment on China because I know you've got a lot of firsthand experience, but I just want to first finish off on my trip to Europe, if I could. What was clearly evident to me on returning then to the U.S. is that we may be actually witnessing here the dying era of inheritance. This is an element of the problem, I think, why economists are mystified with our post-COVID consumer spending, which just keeps on going. The U.S. alone has 72 million baby boomers who are now retiring at about the rate of thereabouts 10,000 a day. Their World War II era parents are dying, and final inheritances are transferring to them. So 2 generations of accumulated assets are now being spent because more than ever before, the baby boomer generation has this attitude that you can't take it with you and You only live once. They are overwhelmingly traveling. I saw that in every airport I was in, and spending while they still have their health. Meanwhile, they're helping with the bills for their overindulgent kids and their grandkids' education and their instilled materialistic expectations. The great wealth accumulated since World War II, which is dominantly through questionable real estate appreciation, is now being liquidated or maybe even indentured. Likewise, the government is spending a wartime budget right now in a peacetime economy, and corporations are surviving on leverage and financial engineering. The EU government, I saw, is no different. Each of the countries. As a consequence, on my flight back from Austria, I heard my dead grandfather in my ear, I really did, who actually prided himself, Charles, on the financial legacy that he would bequeath to his children and grandchildren. I could hear him lamenting about all this and him saying, they are selfishly eating their family's seed corn. He was an old farmer. He would fully believe there would be devastating consequences of this sort of behavior. And all of this has resulted in us no longer being self-sufficient, as we should be, and in fact perilously dependent. Frankly, I just couldn't seem to get that Wile E. Coyote picture that you often put up on your writings in my mind as I was thinking of it. Charles, comments on any of that, either about China or this need for self-sufficiency? Sorry to go so long, but it really ties into the slides we're going to show.
Yeah, absolutely, Gordon. And I think that what I would like to emphasize for our listeners is that what you're asking here and what we're discussing is why has this occurred? And so we're not referring to just charts and economics. We're referring to like cultural, social aspects of these expectations that were really artifacts of an era that's gone. And I'm speaking about especially the 1960s and 70s, when prosperity globally was rising in ways that it's not now. We can measure prosperity in all kinds of ways, but what really matters is the purchasing power of your wages, right? And the growth of your wealth, not in a bubble economy, but because you're saving and you're investing in productive assets. So I can tell you just as an anecdote that I've gone through my 50 plus years of working, and I can say definitively that the purchasing power of my wages was higher in 1977 than at any point since. In other words, as a young carpenter, I made more money in terms of what I could buy. In other words, of shelter, cars, auto repair, insurance, everything. I could buy a lot more 45 years ago than I can now. And statistically, you look at the labor share of the economy and the purchasing power of wages and everything, and it's been declining, for 2 generations. And we've filled that gap between what we used to be able to earn and what we want to spend with debt. And that's also visible. Like, that's how you get a global debt of 400 trillion or whatever. And so that's part of the pincher movement that we're talking about, that the wages have declined for a lot of different reasons, but our expectations have, if anything, increased. That we want all the material, goodies, and we're willing to go ahead and just pay for that with debt. And that appears painless, both politically and within our own budgets. It appears painless until it's too late. And I think that's really what we're talking about.
Comments on China?
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, and you did great work on your presentation on China. And right now, we can look at the Chinese economic numbers, which are about as trustworthy as our own. In other words, not much, but we see that the Chinese households are recognizing that their economy is slowing, and so what's their response? Their response is to start saving more, to put away money for the potential bad times or slower times ahead. And then you look at what the United States is doing, and it seems like people are pulling money out of somewhere and continuing to spend rather unfrugally, shall we say. And so that's 2 different cultural responses to the same kind of situation.
We should never forget, Charles, and as this slide highlights, capitalism is about savings, and that savings being invested into productive assets, while creditism, which is we now have, and I've written extensively, is about debt being used for consumption versus savings being used for productive assets. And so what happens is the former, the savings in capitalism, improves standards of living, while the latter reduces standards of living. And more expediently or more blatantly, the former delivers more for less, and the latter delivers less for more. And what I saw throughout Europe, and what you just highlighted too, is we're getting a lot less now than we ever got, but having to pay a lot more, and it's showing up in purchasing value. And that is a sign of shifting to creditism or shifting towards socialism. But as your governments become too big, they consume more because they consume what we produce. And there just becomes a smaller pie. Prices go up and value goes down that goes with it. And there's an obvious end to consuming more than you produce. And I've talked about this extensively. The United States, we now consume far more than we actually produce as a country. How long does that go on in a family budget? So this slide just continues with some of the highlights of what the slides we're going to show you, what they bring through. I lived through and you did, Charles. We've seen financial crisis cycles that I believe are self-inflicted here continuously. They're like every 8 or 10 years. And we learned that it's always the same thing. In 2000, the dot-com bubble was really a U.S. derivative problem because we learned about credit default swaps, debt obligations, CDOs. It was a whole derivative structure of people leveraging, playing games financially to make profits. And it works until it doesn't. 2008 was the same thing. We called it the U.S. mortgage problem, but it was about MBSs and CLOs, credit loan obligations, twisted names, and that sort of thing. 2020 was slightly different with the pandemic, where it was global policy leadership, but it was just simply nothing more than a debt shock of unmitigated debt into the system that the system had to absorb. And obviously, when there's more dollars out there, prices go up. And 2022 just passed last year. We're in the midst of and still going through a bond crisis, which I would equate to the previous three, which is nothing more than monetary practice associated, or monetary malpractice associated with problems with quantitative easing, taper, Operation Twist, etc. The truth is that fiat currency governments are now trapped, and like the Titanic, there really are insufficient life rafts. And if there's a point I'd like to make on self-sufficiency, make sure that you understand that you need to be looking for your own personal type of life raft, and they're all slightly different. And it'll go on. There's no way you can predict it. But Ernest Hemingway said it as aptly as I could. Bankruptcy came slowly. Then all of a sudden, something will break, and when it breaks, it'll take it with it. But it's unknowable. Except what is knowable, nothing goes on at this when you can't consume more than you produce, because eventually somebody won't pay, and we're seeing that in the bond market. They won't lend the money unless the rates are much higher. The fundamental issue is unfunded liabilities aren't the problem right now. We're going to talk about that in the pensions. The problem is government bonds and what the real value. They used to be considered risk-free. U.S. government bonds are no longer risk-free. That is a profound shift that has happened here in the last 2 years since bonds have completely collapsed. We've never seen bonds collapsing and markets falling at the same time. Charles, any comments so far?
Yeah, I'd like to kind of contextualize what you've been discussing here in the idea that you and I have often talked about cycles and of rising, basically a credit business cycle, right, where credit expands and consumption and productivity expand and everything's great, and then people start over borrowing and investing in speculative bubbles and assets, and then that defaults and a malinvestment ends that cycle, and then people have to kind of pull in their horns. They have to reduce debt, write-downs, etc. This is a normal business cycle, and credit's involved. And so what we're seeing to some degree is there is no retracing, let's pull in our horns and reduce debt. It's just always more. And so what I think is, what I want to speak to is there's no discipline when you have costs that are rising for fundamental reasons, including the fact that there's all the easy resources have already been exploited, right? And so we're having to dig deeper and do more processing to get the materials that we need for the global economy. So costs are rising for a lot of different reasons, regulation and so on. If you can't borrow money, then you have to have some discipline. You have to, in other words, you have to reduce your spending somewhere else. And so what we do, and this is sort of globally, is, well, we just borrow more money. And that's what you're talking about, that's the trap, is that we've lost all discipline. And when I look at what I paid for university, 4 years of university 2 generations ago, I was actually able to work my way through. I was actually able to work enough hours part-time and have my own place and my car and pay for all of my tuition and books and everything. And that, of course, is basically impossible now, right? Because the higher education system has no discipline. As long as the students can borrow another 100,000, well, there's no discipline to impose on the costs. And we can say the same thing is true in healthcare and many other industries. So again, I think your point is our expectations are just no longer aligned with reality. And we've created this illusion that we can have everything we want by just borrowing more money. But as the problem with debt is there's always interest accruing. And as you're saying, if the collateral underneath the debt isn't growing along with the debt, then you've created an unstable structure that's going to collapse. And that's what we're talking about.
Charles, you mentioned about university and working your way through. I did too. It wasn't a big burden. It was just a way of what we all did. We all could do it. Right? You had to work. It wasn't easy, but you did it. I live in a small New England town, and we have a quite well-known small New England liberal arts college here. And it's been around 150 years, and it really, when we first moved here, it was the same dorms, the same buildings. They're really, it's a classic Ivy League looking Ivy school in terms of appearance and everything else. And it's quite nice and well respected. But in the last 10 years, you wouldn't recognize that school anymore. It doesn't have any more students. The new athletic complex, the brand new dormitory structures that have went in, the brand new labs and computer centers that have went in. Like it's just growing in leaps and bounds. There's not that many more students in it. But the amount of money that's been spent and the staff that they're now having, administrative and everything else, it's been pushing up housing in the greater area, is just phenomenal. So where did all that money come from? Well, it comes from student loans and where the money flows and how it flows. And that's a whole discussion into itself. How long can that sustain itself? And now in many cases, the kids are having troubles affording coming to this particular college without scholarships. It's got so expensive for them. So what is the current state of affairs in a nutshell? What we have to look at is this chart. The U.S. national debt is now growing faster than the U.S. economy. Our GDP growth rate has been steadily eroding, while our ability to get credit on this chart is slowing even faster. So meanwhile, our governments are shrinking balance sheets, tightening lending standards, and reining in liquidity in an attempt to stop spiraling inflation. This is not how stable economies are supposed to work. These are signs that something serious is broken, and you can see this just in these last 3 charts. Charles, any comments on those?
Point is, if your collateral isn't growing, which your collateral is both the wealth that you're lending against, but it's also your income streams, right? And if those aren't growing faster than your debt, then eventually the debt is going to overwhelm the system, because it's going to drain the wealth and the income from the system just to pay the interest on the debt, and then you're going to have less money for both consumption and investing, and that's really the trap.
And as you can see on that first chart, the debt is growing much faster, the economy, and that's how only happened here in really within the last decade, the last 10 years. And it's getting wider. The gap is wider. That's the definition of a potential bankruptcy. Now, the government's not going to go bankrupt. I don't mean to suggest that. It goes bankrupt in a different way. Debasement of the currency, lost purchasing power, and lowering standards of living. That's how bankruptcy is when it happens to a sovereign debt. You hope it happens that way if it's going to happen at all, because there's worse ways, and we can go through some of the other countries like Zimbabwe and Venezuela and how they went through it. So what about the trap I mentioned earlier? How is the personal consumption in China, which is 38% of the economy, 51% in developed economies, and near 70% in the United States, why is that? And the answer lies in modern mercantilism, where emerging manufacturing nations sent their profits back to the U.S. to buy our debt, which drives consumer rates down and the buying power of the U.S. dollar up. So therefore, we can consume on debt while the export nations get rich. But now they're getting even richer on our high payments demanded on our debt, sort of like an outstanding predatory credit card rates. So this is a big question, which we will unfortunately have to leave here because of a shortage of time. But that's the core of why we've ended up with that distortion and why we went to this 70%. But with it has come a shift in behavior that's different from 70% of consumption economy. And as you pointed out, Charles, why China's down at 38% is that, and having troubles may shrink down because of this instilled behavioral attitude and expectations that's grown in our economy since the 70s. So the real question is whether a 70% economy is actually sustainable. I'm saying not, but maybe we can show some charts to show that that is the case, that it is not. Comments here, Charles?
No, I think got some great charts about the generational brush. In other words, on top of the general context we're talking about, you're also bringing up that each generation has a different economic context and a set of behaviors. And so I think, we're both baby boomers, and so we have benefited because we bought assets. If we did buy assets, we bought them at much lower rates, and we've benefited from the sort of bubble economy. In other words, the cost of housing and everything has skyrocketed because credit has fueled these investment bubbles. And so the generations behind us have not had that same opportunity to buy these assets at very low prices, and they've seen them double and triple. And I know that seems just almost unbelievable, but I can tell you this is an anecdote from reality, which is some friends of ours bought like a small 2-bedroom, 1-bath, very modest home in the San Francisco Bay Area back in the late 90s for $145,000, and other friends paid like $165,000, $165,000, $175,000. Well, those houses are now worth over $1 million. And you go, well, wait a minute, did wages go up 8 or 10-fold? No, wages might have gone up 40%, but the cost of housing in these very hot in-demand markets is up 8-fold or 10-fold. And so you go, well, that's a tremendous absolute collapse of the purchasing power of wages. And yet, the people who bought those homes for less than $200,000 and now are selling them for $1 million or more, well, they're obviously benefiting greatly from that. But that's concentrated in the hands of the baby boomers and less so for the other generations. So there's this enormous generational inequality that's built into an economy when you financialize that economy and you base all of your so-called wealth on these asset bubbles. And so you've got some great slides here talking about that the generational source and actually the instability of that wealth.
Yeah, the behavior has shifted, and it shifted with each generation. We currently have really 4 generations, all at different stages of their consumption cycle, but they all have completely different problems, and they've compounded on top of each. And each generation has got the previous generation's problems plus some new ones. The explosion in consumption began with and has been sustained by the baby boomer generation, as you say, a generation who is now retiring. I mentioned earlier, where typically their consumption falls off. We just don't. I'm a baby boomer. Don't spend as much. You pretty well bought everything that you're going to need. It's more just a replacement. The problem is that the following generations have been saddled with an economy that doesn't allow them to save and take up the consumption slack that the baby boomer generation will create. And each generational group shown here has been saddled with increasing hurdles to the point that Gen Z, Zoomer generation, are in a position of basic elements of a standard of living such as housing now being quite literally unaffordable. This goes to the root of why a 70% economy is unsustainable. And you can go through and you can see each of the different things that happen to each of these particular generations that instill great costs into them. So how is this going to get even worse? Let's talk a little U.S. history here, remembering why the Chinese save and don't consume at the same rate as Xi Jinping needs. Prior to the dot-com bubble bursting, retirement, as outlined by the U.S. government at that time, should be thought of as like a three-legged stool shown here. In one leg was U.S. Social Security. Two was your savings that you did and were responsible, personal savings pool that you could then invest, and your pension plan from your employer, called a defined benefits plan, because they managed and controlled, and it was a big part of your benefits for working there. And this is the structure upon which the baby boomers are now more or less retiring. But however, what we witness is that employers stopped defined benefits, after the dot-com bubble, basically, and employees were told to develop and manage their own pensions in what is now called contributory pension plans. And employees are now expected to navigate this in the same way as corporations did, the same way they have to manage their own health care additionally. They're on their own to play the stock market or whatever they choose. Unless they have a union or are a government employee, they have no choice but to assume that responsibility. The bottom line, as might be expected, is it has dissolved into nothing now existing for the vast majority. But then we have personal savings in the U.S. has dissolved into savings being almost non-existent, as most are forced to live paycheck to paycheck. Those who've had savings have been forced over the last 2 decades to make almost nothing on their savings as government policies of quantitative easing and zero-bound interest rates penalize pension savings. So now the rates are rising, but to be frank, many retirees no longer have that money left to actually capture these rising rates. It had to spend to carry them during the last 10, 12 years. So we are left with Social Security. Well, let me tell you, 3.2% COLA increases are not even close to solving the inflation problem for retirees. Additionally, it appears to be a shock to new retirees that rising healthcare costs are actually subtracted from their Social Security checks. I don't know how many people have come to me and said, I didn't realize this. And it's taxable when you're on your total income. So, and then you have to have supplemental healthcare plans that are required to adequately cover against costs that will bankrupt you if you're uninsured. And these are not cheap. So security is not really much of a safety net any longer. It won't be anything for Gen X's and Y's and Z if it's even available at all. And I spelled all this out in 2015 in a 175-page annual thesis paper entitled Fiduciary Failure, which is available on the Matasi's site. Other than the charts being worse now than they were then, everything is unfolding as predicted and fully expected. Charles, anything you'd like to add here?
I would just add that 2 things about this whole the context of what you're describing about the decline of private pensions and the dependence on government spending, which is one is that healthcare is the cost of healthcare is just incredibly expensive now, right? That the U.S. spends almost 20% of its GDP on healthcare, and you can say, well, part of this is profiteering and corporations charging more because the government will just go ahead and pay whatever they're charged. And there is that element. And there's a lot of fraud and profiteering. But it's also the health of the American public has really declined. And so that's a whole topic that deserves its own program. But that a lot of what we've forgotten kind of is that we're also responsible for our own health. And so like half of the adult American population is either diabetic or pre-diabetic. And these are very difficult illnesses to manage and very expensive. And so our health has really declined in the last two generations. That the U.S. population, I'll just take one statistic, used to have 1% of the population was diabetic, and now it's about 10 or 11% that's been diagnosed, and then there's 3 or 4% more that are not yet diagnosed. And so we've seen this explosion of chronic lifestyle illnesses or diseases that are burdening the system. And then the other comment I want to make is all these systems were designed in the 50s and 60s, in the glory years, what the French call the glorious 30, right? The 30 years after the end of World War II. And back then there was 5 or 6 workers for every retiree. Now that number, depending on how you calculate it, is more like 2 to 1. In other words, full-time workers, 115, 120 million Americans. Retirees, 65 million. So you're down to two workers supporting each retiree as these healthcare costs skyrocket. That's also it's unsustainable.
Charles, you mentioned housing here a moment ago, and the amount of money that baby boomers have made in appreciation of their housing. Well, I can tell you straight out, I hear more times from fellow baby boomers who have retired and have a big nest egg, if you want to call it that, in their what their house is worth. But the problem they face is that house went up in price. Well, their taxes on that house, its property taxes paid locally, has also went through the roof. So you say, well, that's to be expected. Well, now they're retired and they're living on Social Security and any other available cash, other than really their wealth has been tied up in their house. Their payments on their taxes are now bigger than their Social Security checks. How does that work? Where's your cash flow coming from? So the answer is, well, sell your house and move down in style. Well, that's a tough thing for people to do, and it means a relocation. And by the way, no matter where you go, housing's expensive. So the amount of money you really save, time you go through legal fees and moving and all the dislocation of family, it's still leaving them short of cash. So that's another, and the reason I bring it up, it's just another major untalked about reality that's pushing consumption down on a daily basis and will only accelerate. So how have we become so distracted? Or are we just totally incompetent as a society to get ourselves in what clearly is just like an unbelievably bad position? And I'm afraid to tell you, there are very smart people who know all this, and it is a gravy train of profits for them as the U.S. debt explodes to fund their stealth gravy trains. And that's just the fact of life. And the more time I've spent in the financial industry, I realize that people are getting very wealthy temporarily off this debt increase gravy train. Just to show you the magnitude, Charles, of what's going on. I don't think people really, because we're all busy. But in 2023, this year, Social Security and Medicare accounted for 21% and 11% of the federal budget, respectively. The combined cost of these programs was about 9%, just over 9% of GDP. Social Security and Medicare now constitute more than a third of the budget, leaving non-defense discretionary spending at 16%. The problem is the growth rate. Social Security, Medicare, and interest account for 72% of nominal spending growth. Presently, healthcare, Social Security, and interest explain 81% of projected spending growth, as this chart shows. The U.S. entitlement program is massively underfunded. Everybody knows that. At the federal, state, and local levels, probably even worse at the state and local levels, where their retirement benefits are just unbelievable compared to what they were making when they were working full-time. Additionally, what is considered funded is primarily held in U.S. government treasury bonds. So as they come due to pay the obligations of their pensioners, the U.S. Treasury must surrender the bond value, it's matured, to the plans. Which means the Treasury has to issue massive new debt that must be funded by the financial markets. And that's one of the reasons interest rates are going up. Foreigners also do not have the money in growing currency reserves to buy the amount of treasury bills that we're having to put on the market. It's a tsunami of new issues that few are planning for, at least coming from the Social Security bonds that are now maturing. We're now experiencing exploding interest costs, shown here on our national debt. It's only going to get worse fast. The U.S. has a spending problem. That's the problem. We're spending way more than the revenue coming in. Our revenue coming in is good, though it is now falling off, I've noticed here in the last quarter or two. We're spending like we have a wartime economy, Charles, in peacetime. The COVID-19 shock created a massive problem, but we are only continuing to spend, though COVID-19 is behind us. Like a drug, we've become quickly addicted with no way of stopping. Our budget is bad enough, but it's even worse since the undisciplined, as you called it, overruns on the budget are only further compounding the problem, as shown here. The total debt, so just some numbers, Charles. The total U.S. debt is now $33.6 trillion. It's up $58 billion in one day. A day, $58 billion. And up $604 billion this month. It's up $20 billion every day, up $833 million every hour. And at this rate, the U.S. debt will be $41 trillion in 1 year. I did the numbers. It's unbelievable. For those keeping tabs, the U.S. added $1 trillion in debt in the last 3 months. It's unsustainable, and it's coming quickly. So if the consumer even slows its consumption, even moderately, let's not get exaggerated, let's just say moderately, in the current environment, the whole financial house comes down around its ears in a blazing crisis because the financial markets globally will recognize it. Charles, I pointed this out when in June 2020, when we saw the spending the government was undertaking to address COVID. And we put out a video as shown here, the reverse wealth effect to the consumer. And it's happened. The supply chains has driven up inflation and prices. That's what we said. Where we were wrong, we said, well, the consumer will slow down. Wasn't we talking about retirement or anything else? We were just talking about the general consumer. Well, no, it hasn't. They've been spending. But look at what's happening with the credit cards. Comments on any of this?
No, I think that's very clear, Gordon. And I would just interject one quick thing about the difference between wages going up and discretionary income, like what's left after paying for essential. And what we all know is that the wages are rising, right? But they're not rising fast enough to pay for the cost of essentials such as shelter, healthcare, childcare, food, and so on. As we all know, those expenses are climbing much faster than the wage increase. And so the amount of money, cash, that's left after you've paid for essentials, or it's like we call that discretionary spending, right? Well, that's been declining through this whole multi-year period, right? And so there's less cash, and the only way to spend as much as you want to spend is you have to borrow more. So it's like there's also an increase in debt in the private sector, which is what we're talking about, and that's like in auto loans, student loans, and credit cards, and so the federal debt is rising at an extraordinary rate, and private debt is not quite so extraordinary, but it's still impacting the consumer. That the consumer has to borrow more because their discretionary income is declining, even as their wages rise.
With the full realization now creeping in that pensions are truly not there for Gen X's approaching retirement, and Gen Z and Gen Y now doing the math, consumption will slow. And they're starting to get scared, as this shows. So our conclusions are really what we started with. Here and here. As all this unfolds, we should expect, as is showing here, some cascading dominoes. Rising unemployment, rising bankruptcy, falling consumption. We're only beginning to see this. Falling real estate values, a reverse wealth effect, lenders dramatically pulling in their horns. And so this is beginning to unfold. So the good news is you have time to prepare. You have time to get your house in order now. You don't have to panic. You just have to start to prepare to the best that you can, and everybody's different, and there are no magic bullets here. And that gets back to being as self-sufficient as you possibly can and less dependent on the governments and others. And if you are dependent, make sure you've got the relationships that are going to sustain yourself through the future. That's the only way out of this, Charles. And it really is good news that you got the time. But like we said with that Ernest Hemingway comment, bankruptcy happens slowly, then all at once. So it's slow right now. But when it does happen, eventually, it will be all at once. So you have the time. Any closing comments you want to make, Charles?
Yeah, I just would emphasize what you said, that we have time, but I would say no more than 4 or 5 years. In other words, it's like we've burned off the 15 or 20 or 25 years we had to deal with this. We've pushed it into the point where now there's the crisis will be much faster, and we're running out of time. So yeah, and again, less bad things can happen if you don't have any debt. So that gives you, if you can get rid of your debt, then you have more flexibility to deal with whatever comes down the pike. And so, as you say, to get your own house in order, you have to look at what kind of discipline and choices can you make, and what changes in your value system would benefit you in the reset that's coming. And we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the reset. But as I always say, if you have a tool or you have a property, you have a shelter, it doesn't matter whether it's worth $1,000 or $10 million, it's still shelter. What matters is how much debt you've acquired in the process. And so if you don't have any debt, you don't really care so much what happens in the reset. So that's a thought too.
Like my grandfather when we started, it's also important that we help those who are members of our family, our children, our grandchildren in some cases, that not to give them money. That doesn't make them self-sufficient. It makes them dependent. But helping them on their journey and their understanding of what it is important for them to be able to really live a full and bountiful life, even if there are tough times, because life always deals tough times. But it starts with, again, the same thing, self-sufficiency and living within your modest means, but will create and deliver a fulfilling life to you. Because it's not all about money at all. And the older you get, the more you know that. Charles, we have to break now. As I said, we're well past our usual time. We try and keep these short, but it was a great discussion. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed sharing your ideas, and I look forward to input that we receive on the notes here on the YouTube boxes to do that. Any last comments?
No, I agree with your last comments. I think you nailed it. Life is more than money, but but you want security, and that requires more than just a credit card.
Yeah, money doesn't buy happiness, but I can tell you lack of money sure doesn't create happiness. There's a balance in there. Talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much, Gordon.